After World War II, the U.S. Army began to consider itself invincible. After that, there was the Korean War. Then the Americans were finally convinced that shedding blood away from their borders was both profitable and safe. Therefore, in August 1964, the U.S. Congress easily passed the Tonkin Resolution, which authorized a large-scale invasion of the U.S. in Vietnam. But in the bamboo groves of Vietnam, the Americans encountered enterprising guerrillas. It seems incredible, but even one group of 10 people delayed the arrival of U.S. Army equipment for 3 or even 5 hours. Dense jungles, many rivers and swamps, and an underdeveloped road network are not fully used by Americans for road transport. As a result, the fighters believed that there is nothing left to do but move and fight on their feet. It was there that the Americans received an unexpected and extremely unpleasant surprise: a large number of Vietnamese traps. One of the simplest, but at the same time one of the most difficult to detect traps, was the so-called bamboo cartridge. On the ground, where there were a lot of tall grasses, they dug a bamboo stalk into which cartridges or even large caliber media were inserted. The top of the cartridge protruded slightly from a tree trunk buried in the ground. When the fighter stepped on the trap, the cartridge moved down into the inside of the bamboo. At the bottom lay a thin nail on which the cartridge capsule was pricked, causing the pistol to fire. Most often, these traps are heavy on the legs or groin. Another simple, but no less effective one was the bucket trap. It came out like a regular metal bucket, with the provided fishhooks or stakes rigidly fixed inside and secured at an angle downwards. The bucket was dug into the ground and carefully camouflaged. A soldier who got his foot into such a trap was unable to pull it back out. The only thing a fighter can do in such a situation is to stand still and call for help. In this case, the comrades who arrived in time dug up the bucket and, together with this bucket on the soldier's feet, transported them to the hospital. But perhaps the very essence of the situation, with the consequences of the Vietnamese traps, began to be called punji sticks, which, according to experts, accounted for 2% of the wounded U.S. soldiers. Most often they were made from a bamboo stem, but metal penjas were also found. They had different heights and a twist with a pointed end on one side to hit the victim. Often the pointed ends were smeared with plant or corpse poison in order to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy. Such stakes were installed in camouflaged holes, which were dug in places where U.S. military personnel could presumably move. The point of penetration usually occurs in the calf area. Sometimes the stakes were installed at an angle downwards, as a result of which a fighter fell into such a trap, who had no chance of getting out of it on his own and was forced to call for help. Prudent Vietnamese partisans dug several of these at once next to each other, so that comrades who came running to a cry for help would end up in pits next door. There were also more advanced traps of this type, which were 2-story pits with stakes. Falling down to the bottom of the pit with a punja stick, the fighter touched the edges of other shields, which were also covered from above. As a result, the fighter is skewered both from above and usually Priala Punji lid freely opening 180 degrees. Having caught a victim, she always returned to a horizontal position and expected new victims. To prevent the trap from being noticeable, it was carefully camouflaged. Use grass and leaves as camouflage. Among the simple traps, which included famous soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam, were huge spherical figures making marches on giant clubs. Stones with bamboo or metal stakes embedded in them, smeared with poison, or hung on vines in the jungle. When this large ball with spikes was realized, it fell from the tree. Everything was demolished in its path. Also in the impenetrable jungle, Vietnamese guerrillas use the whip trap. To do this, they bent a bamboo trunk, at the end of which a shield with pointed sticks at the ends was mounted, and connected it to a guy wire. When implementing, apply sharp blows with stakes. About the same, but smaller in size, was the bambooji trap, which was installed in the doorway. It was enough to open the door, and a small log covered with stakes would fly out. Often, traps of this type were set so that the blow would land squarely on the head. When triggered, such a trap caused serious injuries, sometimes fatal. In addition to the above, Vietnamese partisans invented traps in which the main destructive element was poisonous snakes. Most often in such cases, the bamboo keffia was used. This snake is also called the three-step snake, since its venom acts almost instantly. The bamboo keffia is small in size, as a result of which it was easily tied with fishing line to the branches at head level. The partisans shoved this snake wherever possible, into bags, empty bamboo stalks, boxes, and also scattered it on the paths along which American soldiers walked. In the underground tunnels, the keffia was tied to the ceiling with a fishing line, and if the American fighter did not manage to notice it in time, then the angry snake immediately stung the uninvited guest. Another living friend of the Vietnamese partisans was the scorpion. Several scorpions were placed in a small box and used as a tripwire. The box was mounted into the wall of the tunnel, from which a fishing line was pulled to the opposite wall of the tunnel. If the soldier was inattentive, then, having caught the fishing line, a box opened, from which angry scorpions burst out and immediately stung the soldier. However, the most common trap in the Vietnam War was the usual tripwire. But the Vietnamese would not be Vietnamese if they had not improved this type of weapon for themselves. A hollow bamboo stalk filled with a mixture of saltpeter and diesel fuel was mounted under a grenade or other ammunition. This design significantly increased the damaging effect. So on December 6, 1968, in the area of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a similar tripwire claimed the lives of 5 Marines and injured 12 more soldiers. An even simpler trap than the tripwire was also invented in Vietnam. It was called pineapple. Its essence was as follows. Grenades or other landmines were hung on tree branches. In order for the trap to work, it was enough to simply touch the branches. And since combat operations were often carried out in the jungle, pineapples were used quite often. The ground almost literally burned under the feet of the American Army soldiers. During the war, the losses of the American Army amounted to 58,000 people. Over 150,000 more were wounded. More soldiers returned home with post-traumatic stress disorder, many of whom were unable to adjust to normal life.